My Egyptian friends say to me that Egypt has a wide variety of resources. It has a wonderful location, a strategic location. It has fertile agriculture. It has oil and gas deposits. It has a hard-working population. It has a long tradition of learning. But there's a perception that the country's economy has not lived up to its potential. It seems to have fallen behind the performance of many other countries, and it seems not even to have fulfilled the requirements of the Egyptian people. Is this so? If so, why is this so? And what should one do about it? I want to focus just on these issues. Why has Egypt underperformed compared to other countries? Why has it underperformed? And what can one do about it? Or what should one do about it? And I feel very privileged speaking to this audience because it is this young generation that will go out and change matters. So I feel a special obligation to you to be frank about matters. It is urgent that Egypt increases its growth rate and improves its development rate. And one can lay out several reasons, why it is urgent, but let me put it in some graphic terms. Every year, Egypt adds a New Zealand or an Ireland to its population. Every 2 years it does this. Every 3 years, it adds a Denmark or a Finland. Every 4 years, it adds an Israel or a Switzerland. And every 5 years, it adds Spain or a Sweden or a Portugal. But while it adds the population of these countries, it doesn't add their capital assets, it doesn't add their institutions, it doesn't add their systems of governance. So the job for the average Egyptian just becomes more and more difficult. So something has to be done, and something has to be done pretty fast. The second reason is that the population of Egypt is growing very fast, and the labor force is increasing. Again, very rapidly. Anything between 3 to 3.5 and 4% annually. So, if something isn't done very quickly, there's a danger that the country's streets are going to be crowded with hundreds of thousands of young men and women, like yourselves, desperately seeking jobs, desperately seeking shelter, desperately seeking access to health, to education, and so on, and not finding it. And this, I submit, is a mouth-watering prospect for a recruiter from any extremist ideology, because they can promise you the moon. If you take a long-term view of the Egyptian economy, and I'm looking at it from 1965 to 2017, 2018, over a 53-year span, the GDP of Egypt increased in real terms, adjusted for price changes. It increased at an annual rate of 4.6% a year. The average for the East Asian countries, I'm talking about China, South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Singapore, this group of countries, the average was 8.5 to 9, and for China it was frequently 10. Let me tell you what this difference, 8.5 and 10, 8.5 and 4.6 and 9 and so on, might not strike you as all that important. But a dollar growing at 4.6% a year, after 53 years becomes $10. It increases, becomes $10. A dollar increasing at 9% a year, after 53 years becomes $85. The power of compound interest is huge. And so you see that what looks like a fairly not huge difference at the beginning ends up with a very huge difference at the final outcome. So this is why 4.6% maybe looked respectable, I mean, for some countries. It doesn't look respectable for a country with the requirements of Egypt, especially when you see in the neighborhood what other countries have been able to achieve. The next question then arises is, why has Egypt's growth rate lagged behind that of these other countries? Growth rates, GDP growth is driven essentially by two factors. The rate of investment, I mean, how much of your GDP you invest, and how efficiently you use your resources, how efficiently you use labor and capital, which in technical terms is the total factor productivity. It's a fancy name for just saying how efficiently you combine labor and capital in use. So the short answer why Egypt has fallen behind is that it has invested much less than the East Asian countries, and its factor and the contribution to its growth by improvements in factor productivity have also been very much less than those in the East Asian countries. Just to put some numbers on it, over the 50-year period, or the 53-year period that I'm looking at, and then nothing magic about the 53-year period. I mean, 53 years because the most reliable database that I found, which is the IMF and the World Bank database, starts from 1965 and goes on, and it has the GDP and these other variables in constant 2005 prices. So I can make comparisons between years. But a 50-year period is long enough to see what the potential of an economy is. So the potential of the Egypt's economy, given the present rate of investment and given the present functioning of its institutions, is, let's say, 4.6%, but the average investment rate, divided by GDP, over these 53 years was just under 20%, 19 point something, I mean, if you take the decimal point seriously. The average investment rate for the East Asian countries was 35%, and for China was between 40 and 45%. So again, you see a huge difference in the creation of productive assets between Egypt on the one hand and the East Asian on the other. Then you look at how efficiently these two groups use their factors. In Egypt, the growth of total factor productivity was probably less than 10%, and there were periods when it was actually negative. For the East Asian countries, it was 25% on average, and for China, it was a little over 30%. So again, these countries were investing more, and they were using their resources more efficiently than Egypt. The Nobel Prize winner, Paul Krugman, once summed it up, that Egypt's growth was due to perspiration, not inspiration. I mean, what we have to do is to put the inspiration part into the equation a little more. Now, one major factor, and I think this is the right place to raise it, why TFP growth in Egypt was so lagging, is really the education system, and there one goes back to a political point. I mean, after the 1952 revolution, and a few years after that, when the move towards Arab socialism started, a number of things were promised free to the Egyptians. I mean, subsidized housing, subsidized bread, subsidized sugar, subsidized cigarettes, subsidized halawa, I mean, free education and health and so on. Because basically, and I'm putting it bluntly, the strategy of all the regimes since that time has been that we'll give you all these subsidized goodies and you don't overturn our regime. I mean, basically, it's that is the contract, if you like, I mean, between the rulers and the ruled. But you see, that sort of contract carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Because if the population is growing fast and you promise them an endless supply of goodies, I mean, including cigarettes and dessert at one point. I mean, and you're not going to tax them because that again would make them unhappy and sort of make them, go out and demonstrate in the streets and so forth. You're soon going to run out of resources. What you're going to do is you're going to reduce the quality of everything that you give. You've seen, I don't know how many of you are old enough to have seen the old 5 piastre bread, the baladi bread, which the quality of it was steadily decreased, the weight of it was steadily decreased, because frankly, the price had not been changed since 1945. And it cost about 5 times as much to make that loaf of bread as the government got by selling it. Every loaf of bread the government sold, it made a loss, a very substantial loss. The same thing happened with education. I can promise you free education, but then I have to sit back and think that creating a university place in the technical or medical or scientific fields costs about 4 or 5 times as much as creating a university place in the liberal arts. And so I do 2 things. One is, even in the scientific fields, the quality suffers because I don't provide them with up-to-date laboratories, I don't provide them with up-to-date teaching, I don't provide them with all kinds of things like that. But the other thing is that I minimize the number of people I admit into the science faculties. I shovel them into the liberal arts. I mean, go study Arabic literature. That's all you need is a book and a memory. So the labor force in Egypt, the quality of it has steadily been deteriorating. And you can see it in some educational indicators very clearly. For example, the literacy rate in Egypt is 76% of the relevant cohort. The rate in Malaysia is 93%. The rate in China is 95%. The rate in Turkey is 96%. The rate in South Korea is 100% and has been that for many years. So, first of all, you're getting people who are barely literate. Then, if you look at how they perform in the technical fields, again you find that students in Egypt perform much less well than students in other countries. I mean, for example, in standard tests that are administered in science and mathematics, the latest figures for Egypt were 27 in science and 25 in mathematics against world averages of 43 and 41. So it's not only basic literacy is falling short, it's that in the subjects that count in the modern economy, the quality is also deteriorating. And again, it's not surprising why the World Economic Forum, when it was measuring 137 countries for technological readiness, put Egypt in the 94th place, and for the 109th place in innovation. Because of this failure of productivity growth, Egypt has been losing international market share for its exports. Again, let me put it bluntly. In 1950, for every $100 of world exports, Egypt accounted for $1. In 1965, out of every $100 of world exports, Egypt accounted for 37 cents. In 2017, for every $100 of world exports, Egypt accounted for 13 cents. It shows you how much international competitiveness the country is losing or has lost. And a large part of it is the failure of the education system, the investment incentives, and if you were going to say that, okay, we're going to turn things around, you need to have a strategy. And while one can put in innumerable number of factors in what your strategy should be, I mean everything and the kitchen sink, I believe in keeping things simple. So my strategy for Egypt would be that the crucial thing that a government owes its people are two. First, a better life for its citizens, and second, especially given Egypt's history, uh, to prevent it from being vulnerable to pressures from foreign countries and institutions. I mean, protection against external pressures. These are two factors that I would consider that the government has to deliver to its citizens. And let's make this operational. I mean, at the moment, this is a sort of a philosophical point, but let's make it operational. What it means is that you have the first piece of the strategy, a better life for its citizens, means that you have to grow the GDP rapidly. You have to increase people's per capita incomes. I realize that just increasing per capita income doesn't necessarily make you happier or a better citizen. But it's not a sufficient thing. But I believe it's a necessary thing. Because this is what enables you to acquire control of the goods and services that enable you to fulfill your capabilities. And that gives you a life that you have reason to value. The second factor, I mean, of protection against external pressures, I think is self-evident. You don't want the IMF or the World Bank or British Viceroy running Egypt, as happened, I mean, during the, well, starting with what was 1876, sorry, the Castella Debt Publique, right up to the 1930s or 1940s. So, to operationalize those two elements of the strategy, first, you've got to increase GDP at a rapid rate. The second is that you have to cut down your reliance on foreign savings. This basically means you have to reduce the deficit on the current account of the balance of payments. I mean, these are the two factors that you have to. Now, the World Bank's exercises show that the relationship between GDP growth and employment growth is that roughly 1 percentage point increase in the GDP growth leads to a 0.5% increase in the employment rate. So if Egypt's labor force is growing at, let us say, 3.5%, it means that GDP has to grow at least at 7%. I mean, to employ all the additions to the labor force. And probably a little more, because, I mean, a lot of the Egyptian labor force is underemployed. I mean, so to have full employment, and we're talking of something between 7 and 8, but let's stick to 7. I mean, it's a nice round number. How do I get to 7? The 7% requires a much higher investment rate than we've been delivering, because, I mean, the investment rate that we've been delivering has produced only a 4.5% growth rate. So, again, this is crude, but this is the average, I mean, you know, for the East Asian countries and for the others. Roughly, it takes 3.5 to 4 units of capital for an economy at Egypt's stage of development to produce 1 unit of output. So basically, if you're producing 7 units of additional output, you need an investment rate of 28 to 30%. I mean, this is, this isn't rocket science. I mean, maybe quite often, but this is what the empirical data show. And I tend to think of the higher end of the range of investment, because increasingly you're going to have to produce more sophisticated goods. And the more sophisticated goods are going to require more or more expensive capital. So again, let's talk about 30%. Where do I get the money? How does one get to that rate? Because over this whole period, the 50-year period, the average savings rate in Egypt, the domestic savings rate, has been 13%. This is completely unlike the East Asian countries, where the bulk of investment was financed through domestic savings. So they were less vulnerable to what was happening in the outside world, I mean, to a considerable extent, because it wouldn't affect the investment rate that much, because the investment rates were largely domestically financed. But in Egypt, the domestic savings rate is only 13%. Now, let me admit that I cheated a little bit. The picture is actually less bad than it seems, marginally, because the Egypt's national savings rate, the savings by Egyptians worldwide, is higher than its domestic savings rate. The domestic savings rate is the savings rate which within the borders of Egypt. So you've got, I don't know, 6 million workers abroad who are saving and sending back billions of dollars. So if you count their savings, the savings rate goes up from 13% to 15, 16%, 17%, but it's still way short of 30%. If you have the second part of the strategy, which was to, or the second part of the government duty, which is to protect the country from against pressure from foreigners, it means that the deficit of the balance of payments should be limited to no more than 4 or 5% a year. Over this 50-year period, it's been 8.1%. And even this, I think, gives you a better picture than is actually the case. Because the structure of Egypt's external accounts is such that the import side begins to deteriorate faster than the export side improves. And that's largely because a lot of Egypt's food, for example, is imported. 60% of the wheat is imported. I don't know how much percent of the wheat is imported, but I mean, not much less than 60%. And so on and so on. The reason is that Egypt doesn't have the water to irrigate the land that would be needed to produce the rest of the crops that it needs. The binding constraint on Egypt's agricultural growth is water, not land. And the per capita availability of water is falling quite rapidly. So you're locked into importing a large number of commodities, and as soon as you devalue or as soon as the price of those commodities goes up outside, your import bill is hit. I want to change tack a little bit, because what we did is we first started with what was Egypt's performance, and I spouted a few numbers. Then I tried to explain why, what were the proximate, the immediate causes for this low investment and the poor productivity. Let's try to go back one step further and say why the low investment and why the low productivity growth. And there you're in the realm of politics. And there I think we should be asking Dr. Vishai or others to explain, because they know far more about this issue than I do. But what the available literature shows on Egypt, I mean, is that blunt summing up that I gave you, that the regimes, most Egyptian regimes, were pretty insecure because they were not legitimized by a free democratic election. So the contract that they had with the people was, we'll give you these goodies, you let us stay in power. I mean, this is, there was, when I was here, we used to have these meetings of donor, the principal donors every month. And at one of them, one of the ambassadors of one of the major donor companies said, he said, you know, that the Romans used to keep themselves in power, the Roman rulers, by a system of bread and circuses, which means keep the population fed and keep the population amused, and they won't make a nuisance of themselves. And the Egyptian regimes have substituted a regime of bread and surveillance. Keep the population fed with subsidized bread and keep them under police control, and they'll behave themselves. And as I said, that kind of strategy works for a while. And it works for a while. It might work for a while in a place like Saudi Arabia, where you've got not such a large population and you've got oil gushing out of the ears. But even Saudi Arabia is now looking for foreign borrowing and floating bonds and selling shares of Aramco. Basically, I mean, this is a bottomless pit. That your population is growing, their needs are growing, they're looking out at other countries and seeing, how they live, and say, oh, guys, you better make us live like that, otherwise we're going to, change the government. So, what we want to do is to try to find ways where reforms, the necessary reforms to Egypt's economy come about,
without violence. Because the standard model, if I may call it that, of political economy, or the most popular model, most widely accepted model of political economy of development at the moment, was something that follows. In any country, you've got a certain distribution at any point of time of winners and losers. And the winners have become such by virtue of, close association with the monarchy or the religious establishment or the military. I mean, centers of power. And now, if you say that we want, and the present situation, the present distribution of policies suits them because that's what's made them where they are. But if you want to talk about economic reforms to accelerate the growth of the country, to narrow the balance of payments deficit and whatever, you're talking about changes. And so how do you change this situation? Because these guys who are in power, these guys who are the winners, are going to resist being moved to the losers' column. So what the literature says, it emphasizes the role of crises in bringing about reforms. And there are two broad kinds of crises that they identify. The first are military crises, because there what happens is a country suffers military reverse, and the ruling group can be held culpable for that. I mean, it's you guys who made us lose this war. And this fits in well with Egypt's history. I mean, the first revolution, 1952, took place because, the monarchy was blamed for the Egyptian defeat in Palestine. And the second major change in economic policies was in 1956, when Egypt was invaded by Israel and Britain and France. So the British and French properties could be sequestrated, and they couldn't resist because they were the bad guys. And similarly, you can go on to the 1973 war, after which the Infitah, a complete reversal of economic policy came about. The other major factor making for change is economic. But there, the literature, and people have surveyed something like 200 examples of reform. The empirical evidence says that it's not just the presence of an economic factor, like inflation or so, that makes for change, that you can blame the government and compel change. It's the degree to which this factor acts. In other words, things don't have just to get bad. They've got to get very bad before, the population takes it on itself to push for reforms. And last thing, the measurement that a lot of studies have used, for example, there are two major factors making for change. One is foreign exchange crisis, because you can't print money and pay for it. You've got to earn the foreign exchange. And the second is inflation. But for inflation, they say that you have to have an inflation rate of in excess of 40% for 2 or 3 years consecutively before it begins, before the population rises up. Now, what we want to do is not put Egypt through that kind of strain, either military or economic. So, and this I will leave to you guys to work out. You've got to get a consensus that if society is to cohere, if society is to remain stable, if Egypt is to remain the sort of country that we all love, then there has to be a consensus for change. It doesn't mean that the winners become losers overnight. It just means that in relative terms, they become less of winners than they are now. That the gap between them and the losers narrows.